We're going to turn now to open source. Small topic. Our speakers will consider the benefits and risks of open source generative AI models and what some of the liability and safety questions might mean in practice. I am delighted that we're joined by Amanda Brock, the CEO of OpenUK, and Peter Cihon, Senior Policy Manager at GitHub. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Amanda Brock. I can't see any of you. I'm a bit of a rabbit in the headlights here, so if anybody's trying to get hold of us, you're going to have to make some noise. I'm the CEO at OpenUK, and OpenUK is a unique industry organisation based here in the UK. We sort of sit between a traditional industry organisation and a think tank. I think that's a really fair description of us. And the community that I represent is the UK's open technology community, so open source software, open hardware, open data. Increasingly, as we look to AI, that includes open innovation, and as I heard the last panel talking about open standards. So we're here today to talk about striking a balance between open source and AI. And I think just to start, we should think about what open source is. Then we're going to go into how that sits with AI, what it is in the context of AI. We're going to think about benefits, we're going to think about risks, and then we're going to think about striking a balance. And I mentioned that I lead the UK's organisation. We actually are very much the submarine under the digital economy here in the UK. So our open source community is a global community, a collaborative community that people who work in the UK participate in. Many of them are not employed by UK companies, which means many of you in the UK tech sector don't know them. And many of the businesses employ people internationally, so not so many people in the UK necessarily work for them. And that puts us into this position where we contributed in 2022, 27% of the gross value add, the GVA, to the UK tech sector. But most of you will not have seen or know the people sitting in that submarine powering the economy. So open source is software generally, which is made freely available on an open source approved license, a standard license approved by the OSI, and where the source code is shared. Now, when we get to AI, we're going to look at it in a slightly different context, and we're all trying to work out the parameters around that. But for me, open source is not just that legal definition, it's about our whole ecosystem, and that ecosystem here in the UK. I'm really delighted to be speaking today with Peter Cihon of GitHub, and GitHub I will disclose is one of OpenUK sponsors. I think we've only actually met face-to-face once before, and it wasn't in the UK. It was in New York where we were talking about the economics of open source. Yeah. So Peter, can you sort of help me there? I've given what I think open source is and why it's so relevant when we talk about the UK. Where does it sit for you?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Amanda. I can't think of somebody better to have a conversation with in terms of your central location in the open ecosystem here in the UK. So really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you.
So I work on public policy representing the interests of developers, software developers around the world for GitHub. And GitHub is the home of software development. We have 100 million software developers, 3+ million here in the UK. To kind of level set, I think you gave a great kind of sense of that submarine. Too often open source is invisible to most folks. We tend to think of it as our favorite free application. Maybe it's Mozilla Firefox that I keep on my phone and use every day. But in practice, it's really important to think about it instead as sort of building blocks, Legos, that really are ubiquitous digital infrastructure for everything that we use around the world. There's a survey that's run every year by Synopsys, a security company that looks at just how widely spread and widely used open source software is. And depending on the year, it might be 96 to 99% of all software, proprietary or open, uses some aspects of open source. And for a given software stack, about 75% of that software is in fact open source. Yeah. So the submarine piece is good, maybe an iceberg, and we can think about the tip that we do see, but the ubiquity.
We're warm and fluffy, we're not an iceberg, come on.
The ubiquity of open source, I think we can agree on. And the economic impact is significant. There's a lot of work being done to expand that research, and it was great to meet you in that context. Depending on the survey, whether it's from the Bureau of Economic analysis in the United States, thinking about $36 billion a year contributed to the US economy from open source, or from European Commission sponsored work, finding between 65 and 95 billion euro a year. But the challenge really is, in measuring that impact accurately, because those numbers that I just offered you are really looking at kind of the cost it takes to create something. But the real value in open source is the zero marginal cost of reusing it. We can all stand on the shoulders of giants and use Lego blocks that have been built by folks before us. And so those numbers I gave you are a drastic undercount.
Yeah.
And it can expand as we get into AI, similar kind of impacts.
Exactly, and I think that's really something we should just very quickly drill down into. So when we look at that in the UK, what OpenUK does is a lot of research. We do an annual survey, we work with the economic modelling that's used by the Commission, that's used all over the world, and we've produced various different analysis of that. That 27% figure that I gave you is actually slightly different. It's not looking at the inbound, it's looking at the outbound. And working with the models that come out of the Office of National Statistics and others, looking at that big picture. And the reason that's so important, not just understanding what open source is, but contextualizing it, is the position of open source in the UK. So in the UK, we are number one in Europe by number of developers, by number of lines of code. And we're number one by a significant gap. Germany's number 2, France is number 3. France is super interesting because they're moving at pace to grow their open source with government backing. And the figure you gave about 3 million, I think we are officially at 3.2 million now. So when you look at that in the context of the UK, it's 4.5% of the UK population who have GitHub accounts. And that's been the traditional measure of an open source developer. Now we've moved from that and we're looking into further detail that we'll be releasing even later in November. But going back to AI, contextualizing open source, contextualizing what it is and the importance, particularly here in the UK, how do we apply that in the AI space?
So much to say. Well, I think first let's take the open source software and its role in building AI before we kind of dive into what open source might mean in the AI context. So those ubiquitous Lego blocks are also at play in open source. In AI development, right? So we think about the frameworks that have really turbocharged development in the last 10 years with TensorFlow and increasingly PyTorch. Those are two of the most popular projects on GitHub that receive contributions from developers around the world. But it's at every layer of the stack. So as we move up and think about toolkits to evaluate AI systems for bias or for governance, the government of Singapore has an AI Verify framework that's connected to both domestic and US and international standards. That is a package that's available on GitHub and you can run on your AI system. So there's truly ubiquitous, but increasingly we've seen, especially in the last sort of year and a half, open source coming for models as well, kind of that intermediate layer of the stack, and that's gotten a lot of attention from folks. There's so much to say. You can take me in different directions, but I think one piece that's important to emphasize here is that the definition for open source AI is actively being worked on the open source initiative that you kind of called out at the outset as the arbiter for the definition. There are clear analogies where we can think about distributive, collaborative development that's done in the open and allows folks to build on and extend models in new ways. There's clear disanalogies as well, and I know folks have raised some concerns about accessibility to compute as a barrier. So, if you truly wanted to, in the proper open source sense of scrutinize the source code and then try to build it again yourself, you might run into challenges if you don't have access to cloud computing or local servers. So that's an important piece to call out, but it's not prohibitive. There are nonprofits, there are plenty of actors that are building open source models from scratch, but there's so much that you can do with a model once it's built. And I'm sure we can get into some of those advantages too. Yeah,
and I think that's super important. And again, bringing it back to the UK context, when we look at the positioning that the UK has in AI, I was at the Guildhall dinner on Monday night with the digital minister, and she talked about the UK's positioning where we have 1% of the population and we're third in the world in terms of AI, and in terms of AI business and revenue, I think she was referring to. Now, that has to be a very dramatically lower third than the first and second, because when we look at AI compute, about 90% of that happens in the US and China, and there are about 9 companies with these LLMs, these large language models, and we don't have access to them here in the UK. So we see things like Falcon coming out of the UAE. There are a couple of truly open source by the traditional open source definition models, but there are a number of open models that involve open innovation. And in the summer, OpenUK was in quite an unusual position. We worked with Meta on the launch of Llama 2. And I don't think any other open source organization felt comfortable doing it because they're very focused on open source. In our case, we have this broader remit of open technology, and we want to work with people who are innovating and who are doing open research and that broader picture. And as we see those models open up, for the UK, if we want to be able to compete, that's going to be essential. We need access to these models, and they're huge. They're huge in compute, they're huge in the energy they use, they're huge in the resources they have, and they're just huge in the amount of money that has to go into them. So I think for us, probably more than almost any other country, if we want to keep that positioning, we really have to engage with it. And as we start to think more about the benefits of AI, you know, one of them for the UK is obviously the access to that innovation. But Peter, where do you see those other opening up benefits coming?
Yeah, there's a huge piece in just opening up that innovation, as you're saying. People are able to take models and do innovative things that no one foresaw. And you know, that we can get into some of the risks that might come from that down the line, but I think it's worth calling out at the outset that open innovation opens up the ability of folks to contribute. And so we think about diversity of the folks who are able to work in leading labs, and maybe only 4 of them, versus folks who can contribute, whether it be in academic institutions, nonprofits, or other companies. That's a key piece. There's also diversity of the models themselves. So some folks are worried about systemic risks associated with failure modes of, say, very popular models, and most of those most popular models today are proprietary. If we think back to what's happened in open source software over the past 30 years, and today thinking about 75% of given software is relying on open source components, if there is a future that resembles that for AI, we imagine much more diverse sets of Lego blocks and reduced risk of systemic failures from, say, overly being dependent on one leading model. That capacity brings a lot of benefits to competition, to innovation, but also to support government capacity, whether that's kind of in a regulatory context, relying on folks that haven't worked in a leading lab, or trying to do digital development. You know, it's worth calling out the role of open source in digital public infrastructure, a big initiative being pushed by the Indian government, and the Digital Public Goods Alliance, kind of an international multi-stakeholder body that has some UN membership, that's focused on taking open source and open source AI components to support development initiatives, because maybe it's too often implicit, but when something's released, it's available for free, and you can run it at much reduced cost in contrast to proprietary solutions. There are plenty of benefits. I think the one that I haven't mentioned yet, but we should certainly dive into, is transparency. The norm, well, I guess, the elephant in the room is that large language models are largely black boxes, not well understood. The open source community is really pioneering best practices in terms of models documentation, model cards, data documentation, data sets. The Pile by Eleuther is kind of a classic example that I really point people to in having policy conversations of identifying what is that best practice, thorough documentation of all of the data that they've collected and the refinement processes that they've gone through. As a result, you have much better understanding of what these models, went into these models, and assurance in using them. It also supports open science. So a lot of the questions that people raise around AI and uncertainty lead to need for more research. And we think about reproducible science, moving away from alchemy and engineering and just throwing things at it, and instead getting into something where you've seen the thorough documentation of how something was created, and you can iterate and move a new direction. So really important to emphasize the transparency piece and how that can really deliver on reproducible science, but also the policy objectives that we see up at Bletchley Park and increasing trust in these technologies. with so much concern.
Absolutely, and if anybody else like me listened to Rishi Sunak's speech last week, trust featured very heavily. I think he said you could trust me about 5 or 6 times. And to create that trust, you need to build transparency, as you're saying, Peter. I think there's also the element where not just competition and innovation, but skills development for individuals, for actually getting people engaged, not just the academic learning, but learning as part of that global contribution and collaboration that comes with open source. And something we saw yesterday in the Bletchley Declaration was this discussion of an ongoing open international collaboration. And I think that will extend post-summit into more collaboration in a structured way, more engagement with the open communities, I hope, from the UK government and beyond. So the opening it up for the benefits is very important. Now, I don't know if you and I are going to agree here. And since last time we talked, we've probably both read a lot about what happened yesterday, about Kamala Harris's speech, about what was going on at Bletchley. And I'm not normally sitting on a stage saying, I agree with Rishi Sunak, I agree with Rishi Sunak. But I'm going to say it the third time, why not? I agree with Rishi Sunak. We really have to focus on how we regulate. You know, I've been sat in this tech sector in the UK for 30 years. I might not work in the UK so much. I might work globally, but I've been sat here for 30 years. And I was involved in building regulation 30 years ago for the internet. And we wouldn't have made choices we made had we had a crystal ball and been able to see the future. And today, when we're looking at AI and AI regulation, we have to learn from that past, in my view. We can't go through a situation where we have legislation that we try to cover every detail in, where we try to regulate things we don't understand, where we force detail into something that will not flex for the future. In my mind, we need to build something that's agile, that's flexible, that will grow with the innovation, and will allow us to have a balance between innovation and protecting the citizen. You know, we have to protect people, but we have to think about how we do it. And to do that, we have to understand risk. You know, I was a lawyer for 25 years, and I guess you can't get rid of that. So I think about it in terms of liability and how we manage that risk. And you can't manage risk if you don't understand it. In the UK, over the years, we've probably been too risk averse. And there needs to be some level of tolerance if we are going to take a place on the world stage. So for me, I think that the approach we're taking, where we will regulate, but we will do it in the most flexible way we can, hopefully principles-based, and not get into this minutiae of detail is the right approach. Now, you're coming from the US, and Kamala Harris was clearly putting her stake in the ground yesterday, saying that whatever is happening about collaboration, we're going to lead. What do you think about all of that and where the regulation is going?
There's so much to say. I think you know, picking on concrete harms for folks today and thinking about risk are 2 pieces I want to pull on what you were saying. There's plenty of activity in the United States context, but I think, you know, when GitHub tries to support developers around the world, we're really taking that global approach to regulation and have been very busy in the EU conversation, and some of the learnings there certainly can apply elsewhere. I think, you know, first and foremost, it's worth calling out that regulation is needed today, and it should really focus on high-risk use cases of deployed AI systems. And open source shouldn't get a free pass because it's open source. If you're using a model, regardless of whether it's open source or not, to determine someone's access to life opportunities in education, finance, or what have you, those should be closely scrutinized and regulated, open source or proprietary. That was the proposal from the European Commission in 2021, and you know, I think that piece has certainly remains relevant today, and I think it's important to see through a lot of, you know, subsequent developments and hype and doom to really keep a laser focus on the ways that AI is harming people today and the need for regulation to address that. Now, that's not to say that we should have our blinders on to all of the developments that have been happening, and there's so much to be said on that piece. Policymakers are increasingly looking up the value chain. They're not thinking exclusively about a deployed AI system, but instead, how can developers be incentivized or obligated to do things upstream that has downstream benefits? And that has had, it's woken up software developers. It's really gotten a lot of folks at GitHub and in our communities, you know, alert to the policy conversation. And you know, if you take a look on the internet, you'll see that our CEO was quite vocal around activities in the AI Act to make sure that open source software developers are protected as obligations kind of move up the line. And so we've done a lot about detailing a risk-based approach to managing open source software development in the EU as regulation on AI, cybersecurity, product liability, there's a lot going on, comes through the pike. But I guess the piece to emphasize is as we take a look upstream and think about imposing rules on companies developing the technologies as opposed to simply deploying them, that can be well and good, but we need to make sure that those are fit for purpose for open source contributors as well. Let's not expect an open source maintainer of a project or a nonprofit that's offering an open source model to the world to do the same activities that we might want to hold a Meta to.
Yeah, and I think that's critical, right? And what we're seeing, and I'm going to take a slightly different stance on what the EU's done. So what we're seeing is a lot of conversation about open source. And for me, it is incredibly frustrating. And I have had people at political party conferences recently and at different events I'm in telling me we should ban open source. We need to regulate open source. And if I was to push them on what open source is and how it works, they could not answer that question. So everybody has an opinion, and a very small group of people seem to have an understanding. And it would be really lovely if those who are going to make the regulation get into what it is. And you mentioned the developers, the contributors, the maintainers, the people who gift their time, the people who contribute to build this open source ecosystem that today is 96% of our software stacks, or it's actually 76%, sorry, 96% of our software depends on it. And it either needs open source to run or it includes open source. So we can't just ban it. This is a 30-year program that's come to the point of fruition where it permeates our society. And what we need is to learn from what's going on across the water in Europe, I think. And when we look at the regulation there, you mentioned the Cyber Resilience Act and Product Liability Acts, hugely controversial. And what we have to think about is there's a creation, there's a deployment, and there's a utilization. And AI, open source, whatever it's going to be, is a tool that's used in environments. And those environments will range from being a consumer environment all the way through to a highly regulated infrastructure. And where you have things like healthcare, you have things like banking, finance, where the regulation is very different. And it will have to contextualize. So my view is very much that we should be looking at how those nuances are regulated within those sectors, and it should be very much principles-based. Now, I think it's fair to say that the majority of the open source communities would also agree that there is some need for AI regulation. We're not looking for a Wild West. What I think that community wants to see is regulation that works in a very structured way with deep understanding of how their ecosystems and infrastructures work, and with respect for the contributions that they make. And if somebody is not being paid to do work, you choose to use it, then having them have liability is a very difficult issue. We really need to see the exchange of money for that to happen. I would advocate for more of it to be a digital public good that you've already mentioned, Peter, and to see more government funding being pushed into this ecosystem. But when we look at that big picture and how it gets into AI and the importance of it, we know that that's going to be across every aspect of our living going forwards, right? And up at Bletchley, they're talking about risk. We've talked a little bit about risk from a regulatory, from a policy, from a big picture perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the risks are and whether those risks are actually any different in open source.
I think that's the key question. So what is the difference of risk for open versus closed? There's a lot of conversation on frontier AI at the Bletchley Park Summit, and I think we should get to that. But before diving into that subset of kind of the AI conversation, to really take holistically this open versus closed debate, because too often there are a lot of folks kind of opining on Twitter, and I would love to see much more research, much more informed policymaking on precisely this. The questions that I ask are, especially in the, I guess, before we jump in, thinking about misuse risk is something that's commonly raised in open source AI conversations. And it's helpful to ask kind of two things in my mind. One is the question, what is the counterfactual risk for this activity from AI? So, take, for example, misinformation. Misinformation is not a new phenomenon. I'm sure many folks have received emails that are purporting to be from some loved one or maybe a Nigerian prince over the years. And it's important.
Did I say now that I thought you loved me?
It's important to ask kind of what is that counterfactual risk raised by AI. And so, concretely, in this case, we can be concerned about it becoming much easier to write that letter, that love letter from the Nigerian prince.
Absolutely.
In this case.
I'm not going to escape this now. I shouldn't have said anything.
But some of these pieces remain the same. The distribution of that is going to go through email. The distribution is going to go through social media. These channels exist. Okay, but what the counterfactual from AI? But then, what is the marginal risk of making a model openly available? So, I'm sure many folks have sought help in drafting emails from ChatGPT, Claude, or your favorite assistant, or tweets, or what have you. Those are all closed models, and you can certainly increase the scale of misinformation using a proprietary system. To be clear, that the marginal risk is really around observability. So if somebody can distill down a model that is openly available and run it on local hardware, people might be concerned that it's hard to essentially draconianly view and surveil what they're doing. But a lot of the harm in the world is going to be taken on further steps. So, I don't want to get into too many of the hypotheticals that we've seen thrown around by a lot of folks, but in order to do harm in the world with the support of an AI system, you need to take actions in the world, and those actions are visible by law enforcement and prosecutable. So I think it's worth kind of asking the two questions: what is that counterfactual risk that we're bringing into the world with this AI system? And what is that marginal risk of allowing it to be open? And too often we're not really asking those crystal clear questions.
Yeah, often when I hear people talk about open source in the context of AI, they're shouting about banning it or changing it or regulating it. But when they're talking, what they're talking about actually isn't open source. They're talking about AI full stop. And it's just a lack of deep understanding in the noise of what the actual risks around AI are. And I agree with you. I think the vast majority of those risks actually exist across AI, and we need to focus on AI generally, and then we need to get this deep understanding of how open affects. And it's not just going to be open source software. We're going to talk about open data as part of that open AI picture as we go forward. Not for the conversation today, but it is very, very important to this context. So we get to a point where we see that there may be some strong benefits to open source software, which we definitely don't get from closed or proprietary AI models. We see that there is some risk, but the risk can be understood. We can work towards that understanding and try and balance that risk, manage that risk. How do we balance it?
That's the challenge before policymakers and everybody in this room today. Well, let's jump on one of the risks that is top of mind for folks in Bletchley, and then maybe we can try to pull it out and think about that balance. But
now, bear in mind, we've got 3 minutes to wrap this, so I just want to make sure that you get the thing
appreciate it.
Said.
Frontier risks. So, what we've just said around misuse, maybe there are some different approaches. I think it's worth calling out that frontier AI may warrant additional scrutiny and different perspectives. The way that I offer it as a definition that I think is more friendly to open source stakeholders is to think about this as a receding horizon of the unknown. It's not GPT-4 forevermore with stringent expectations on an open source developer that wishes to build a GPT-4 capable model in a year's time, but instead the justification for frontier kind of regulation is really the uncertainties that lie at that vanguard. Now, there are kind of two key assumptions that I think are underpinning a lot of this focus, and it's worth calling those out briefly. Emphasis on briefly, can have further conversation. But one is this question of offense-defense balance in AI systems. So I think there's a lot of presumption that making a new model available, whether it's open or closed, differentially supports the attacker, whether they're trying to get into an online system and cybersecurity breach or cause harm in the world. But there hasn't been a lot of work to just understand to what extent this is true versus saying support defense. And it's really encouraging to see the executive order come out of the White House this week directing agencies to start using large language models to detect vulnerabilities and patch them at scale within computer systems and critical government software. More work looking at the defensive uses of these models will really support a vibrant ecosystem going forward and help perhaps check that assumption that a release necessarily supports an attacker as opposed to the defender. The second key piece is around emergent capabilities, these unknowns that may just pop up. And it's important to emphasize that this is not a foregone conclusion or consensus. there was a very helpful paper that came out of Stanford that asked the question, are emergent capabilities a mirage, a function of our measurement of them? Concretely, some examples that we've seen around emergent capabilities that might be top of mind for folks is GPT-3 was trained and suddenly it was quite good at writing software code in a way that GPT-2 was not, and was not anticipated by OpenAI when they trained it. We've seen all sorts of fun uses of that down the line for good. Another is GPT-4 kind of being quite good at standardized exams, impressively so. But what's helpful to call out is thinking about how that scales. So it's one thing to say, write a slightly more convincing letter. It's another to say, I got this multiple choice question wrong, and then suddenly I got it right. The Stanford paper really helpfully calls out the need for linearly scaling benchmarks so that you can predict with greater precision how something will perform as opposed to these odd lumps of saying, oh, suddenly I got the question right. Now what's encouraging is that on both sides of the Atlantic, we now have AI safety institutes that can start to do research on this. The role of open source and open...
They're going to collaborate.
I hope so, yeah, embracing open source collaboration. But open source and open science will really support us to check some of these assumptions that are having us so concerned about frontier AI.
I really need us to wrap up, Peter. I'm sorry. When we would have a conversation like this in a general context, I would be speaking with Peter for 45 minutes, an hour, maybe more, because there is so much to share with you, as I'm sure you're gathering. We really appreciate having been included in the Fringe. Quite often, open source just gets completely missed, and the deep expertise that the UK has in this space and our global partners like GitHub, who we work constantly with, aren't in the conversation. So it's absolutely fantastic to have been part of that today. If any of you are interested in learning more about open source and OpenAI and where that's all going, please do engage with OpenUK. We have our own conference, 6th and 7th of February, State of OpenCon. The first 2 hours will be OpenAI plenaries, and we'll have Alex Davis-Jones, Shadow Minister, but we'll also have Stormy Peters from GitHub coming along to talk about that. So I do hope that some of you will continue to engage with us in this conversation, because it is going to be absolutely critical. And I know that we will be having this conversation with DCIT, with government, and with the opposition as we move through the next few months. So thank you very much. Sorry there's no time for questions, but we'll both be around if anyone wants to talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amanda.